Many teachings of the Buddha are misrepresented in some way or another, and the teachings on dependent origination that are special to the Buddha are no exception to this. While many of those traditions, acknowledge that dependent origination is the only thing special to the Buddhas, and thus leading to Nibbana, they misunderstand Nibbana, or at least misrepresent Nibbana completely. Oftentimes people think of Nibbana as a kind of annihilationism event, where they completely blank out, consciousness fades, and there's just nothing, because that is their idea of unconditioned nothing. Today we try to understand what the Blessed One really meant with specific conditionality as in relationship to dependent origination. But as it is often the case, I want to start with a few examples of how people typically misrepresent the teachings that are displayed in the suttas. And the first example would be the common viewpoint that everything is conditioned. I mean, technically that is true, but it doesn't really have anything to do with what the Buddha explained. They think of the entire universe as some kind of computation. They think of it as fate, that everything is predetermined. And this kind of insight or this kind of realization is something that is quite common. As a recent example, I encountered a German musician who had a pretty big drug problem in the past. And at some point he died, technically, and came back. And his realization is that everything is predetermined, that everything is fate, and something along those lines. So this kind of realization is actually quite common. But that does not mean that it will free you from suffering. But in total, everything changes according to causes and conditions. And that is something that you can realize while still being fundamentally affected by suffering. While this kind of rule system, let's put it like that, might be true, it is completely irrelevant from the point of view of the Dhamma. But what did the Buddha have to say about this? If you, for example, have a look at Majjhima Nikaya number 26, he said, I considered this Dhamma that I have attained is profound, hard to see, hard to understand, peaceful and sublime, unattainable by mere reasoning, subtle to be experienced by the wise. But this generation delights in attachment, takes delight in attachment, rejoices in attachment. It is hard for such a generation to see this truth, namely specific conditionality, dependent origination. And it is hard to see the truth, namely the stilling of all formations, the relinquishment of all acquisitions, the destruction of craving, dispassion, cessation, Nibbana. If I were to teach the Dhamma, others would not understand me, and that would be very troublesome for me. So as you can see, the Buddha was not exactly, and this is a quite unpopular view, and a quite unpopular fact according to the suttas at least, was not very inclined to teaching in the beginning. And it took a certain Brahma to come down from the Brahma heavens to convince the Buddha that there really are people with little dust on their eyes, for which it is worth to actually teach the Dhamma as they would understand him. Most people would not, and the Buddha is absolutely right in that. But in the end, he decided to teach, which is good for us, because the Dhamma is still available today. But the Buddha mentioned a few very interesting things in this very statement, shortly after his liberation. And what he mentioned is that there is this thing called specific conditionality, and that there's also something called dependent origination. You could even think of those things as synonyms. And it's not difficult to see at all that things are conditioned, as an example. Every scientist in the world can do that, or at least those scientists who are interested in that. You need a certain degree of intellect for that. But apart from that, not much else is necessary. And you can surely be certain that many of the scientists today, and luckily I am a scientist, so I can kind of judge that, do not really bring what it takes to the table. They are not necessarily emotionally stable in most cases. In many cases, in Germany at least, they are quite alarmist, they became quite political, and they do not possess the cold-heartedness that Mark Twain, as an example, praised as the number one quality that a scientist has to bring to the table to actually make good science. And that's kind of sad, but as the Dhamma exceeds mere reasoning, which is what scientists are usually very good at, they cannot attain the Dhamma. That's not possible. But the gist of it is that the unspecific kind of conditionality, the one regarding space and time, the past, and the universe being a large computation, or just seeing that everything changes according to causes and conditions, that is not what the Buddha has been talking about. That is easy to see. That is easy to understand. That is not subtle. And in fact, that has not much to do with virtue or being attached to certain things. Those things are completely unrelated. And as such, you do not need any training described by the Buddha to see it. So it must be a different kind of conditionality that the Buddha talked about, that is only for the wise and not for sensual beings, not for those who delight in attachment, as the Buddha mentioned, because those cannot see. So this kind of specific conditionality and truth that the Buddha was talking about must be something in relation to all those things, in relationship to craving. And for example, in Samyutta Nikaya number 12.20, he said, "Medicants, I will teach you dependent origination and dependently originated phenomena. Listen and apply your mind well, I will speak." And what is dependent origination? Rebirth is a condition for old age and death, whether realized ones arise or not. This law of nature persists, this regularity of natural principles, this invariance of natural principles, specific conditionality. A realized one understands this and comprehends it. Then he explains, teaches, asserts, establishes, clarifies, analyzes, and reveals it. Look, he says, rebirth is a condition for old age. Look, he says, ignorance is a condition for choice. So the fact that this is real, not unreal, not otherwise, the specific conditionality of it, this is called dependent origination. And as you can see, the entire, let's call it, chain of dependent origination, even if it's in reality just two factors are enough. You just want to understand the principle of dependent origination, that one thing can condition the entirety of your experience, the entirety of your suffering. And the Buddha said, I teach only suffering and how to end it, nothing else. And unless you want to imply that the Buddha lied, all the statements that he made kind of have to be related to suffering. And it's not just a condition that you understand, it is about the specific condition for suffering. This is what he teaches. This is the absolute essence of the Dhamma. And practically, you remove just a certain part of your experience. You just remove the poisonous arrow, the poisonous dart. You remove the three poisons, greed, aversion, and delusion, that make your experience unpleasant, so to speak. Well, not unpleasant in terms of feelings, but unpleasant in terms of suffering. You do not remove everything. That is the problematic bit. The aggregates remain standing in the world, as the Buddha said in certain suttas. The wise just remove the desire and longing towards those aggregates. So the beautiful things remain standing. And the same is true for the ugly things and all the other things. It is not that your consciousness just blinks away and then you are in some kind of magical nibbana world or something along those lines. This is not what the Buddha was talking about. And it's good to remember that from time to time. Arahants still are there as individuals, so to speak, as Puggalas. You do not become a vegetable or you vanish, you do not become imperceptive or something like that. Your consciousness, you are conscious and bright, you are awake, alert, aware, you are full of energy. Yet, for the Arahant, all the causes for suffering are extinguished. And you can't have a magical sensation of all consciousness and still talk to other people or things like that. That is... I do not know who came up with this idea of the Arahant or of Arahantship, but this can only lead to people believing that Arahantship is impossible or something like that. And this is a problem. So in essence, we just remove very specific conditions. We do not remove the very process of conditionality. It's just all those things that are related to suffering, that are the root cause of suffering. Those things are what we remove through training. And all of this is impossible to, let's say, will or reason into experience. It is a matter of training, not a matter of thinking or pondering or reasoning or any of that really. And it is only for the virtues and wise. And this point is often overlooked because virtue and wisdom to a degree, virtue and samadhi to a degree, are a necessary precondition to seeing any of that. Without a degree, a sufficient degree of virtue, and this depends on your wisdom faculty, the more wise you are, the less virtue and samadhi you need. But you do not know how much wisdom you have in advance, so better be more careful and cultivate more virtue and more samadhi you have in advance. So without that necessary condition in place, there is nothing to see for you. And when there's nothing, well, there are things to see, but those will be the wrong kinds, because your entire experience will be colored by your views. Our views that are situated on the level of gut feeling color the way we perceive the world. And whatever is infected by craving will lead to some kind of Well, craving infected perception and craving infected experience. And this kind of craving has to be removed sufficiently for us to see reality as it really is without craving. This is what the Dhamma is all about. And samadhi and virtue kind of remove this poison. The virtuous part tries to pull out as much of the arrow as we can on the level of body and speech, and the samadhi, the concentration, removes as much of the poison as possible on the level of the mind. And only based on that can we, in hindsight, see the conditions that led to the now suffering-free state. So only once, I often give them a metaphor of shaking the snow globe. Only once we have stopped shaking the snow globe and the snow has settled, then can the truth that the Buddha was talking about be seen. And nibbana, in the end, full nibbana, this means that the wound of craving has been fully healed. And this is what we ultimately try to achieve in the practice. Removing the poison, however, requires knowledge on what the poisonous part of experience actually is. You cannot just start removing parts of your body where you suspect that they might be poisoned. So first of all, you have to straighten your view to learn what the poison actually is, so that you know what to look for. And the practice also means that you remove big parts of the arrow that is stuck in your skin. But you have to learn to identify it. Without being able to identify it, you cannot remove it in any targeted fashion. You cannot just start pulling your hair or nails or whatever, thinking that it might be the poisonous arrow that the Buddha was talking about. So you have to straighten your view, which works based on virtue. The more virtuous you are, the more straight your view will be. And based on that virtue, the more samadhi you cultivate, even more straight will your view become. Because a view is not something that we change based on intellectual reasoning or something. Changing a view is based on experience. In the end, we talk about wisdom, and wisdom is always there in relation to experience. At least for me, wisdom was always a very vague concept and a difficult to understand word. For example, in role-play games, there was often an attribute called wisdom, but I never really knew what it meant. But in the end, it is just the gut feeling kind of understanding you attain through actually experiencing something. You are wise when you have experienced a lot and learned from it, so to speak. If you have burned yourself on lots of different things, then you know by experience and by heart that certain things will lead to unpleasant results in the future. And you will understand that sensuality is actually painful and not something worth striving for. Why? Because you have burned yourself on sensuality multiple times. And as such, you know you are wise now, even if it is just, at least this kind of wisdom is just a mundane kind of wisdom. The wisdom that the Buddha was talking about really destroys the root of craving. But only once you have really undermined and destroyed the view that sensuality is actually something pleasant, then there's room for the Dhamma to grow. Then there is something to realize. Then you can understand the freedom from suffering. Only then is it actually possible for a mind to leap out to the deathless, so to speak. Before that, it's absolutely impossible. But anyway, I think I made my point clear. You only remove the root of craving. You remove craving to remove suffering. It is a specific kind of conditionality. It is not just that all conditions are bad, or everything is conditioned or something like that, or everything is impermanent. Yes, everything is impermanent, and yes, everything is conditioned. But how does that relate to suffering? This is kind of the important aspect. How do you remove the actual very specific condition for suffering? How do you remove the actual very specific condition that allows for craving to re-arise in the future again and again and again, and keeps the wheel of samsara spinning? This is what you must understand. This is what we are ignorant about. And this kind of understanding, on the level of gut feeling, again, the right view is a shift in experience. A view is something that colors the entirety of our experience. And we have to change that. We have to remove wrong view so that right view can arise. But anyway, let us now come to the most... Well, nice try. But first of all, everything being conditioned does not mean that this is a condition for suffering. As I said many times in the video, dependent origination is, according to the Buddha, subtle and hard to see. It cannot be seen by those who are not trained in virtue and samadhi. And this is important. So it cannot be the scientist's kind of dependency, or the computational universe theory as an example. Because more often than not, and I think thus far I have not seen a single exception of a scientist who is also trained in virtue. So it cannot be this kind of conditionality that the Buddha has been talking about. It cannot be seen by those with delight, period. And the difficulty of seeing dependent origination is usually not apparent to outsiders. It is always misconceived through a sense of self, through craving. Craving, again, colors the entirety of your experience. So whatever you see is usually seen through a pair of colored sunglasses, so to speak, where you do not even know that you are wearing them. To you, this is how experience must be. You do not know that you are wearing sunglasses, but you have to remove them and understand the process nonetheless. And this really requires a Buddha. And the more you progress on the path, the more veneration and awe and simple respect you will have for the Buddha. And with the depth of your understanding, your veneration of the Buddha increases exponentially. But anyway, this should be enough for today. Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoy what we do here, feel free to like, subscribe to the YouTube things, and maybe if you're interested, join the Dhamma Hub Discord server. But apart from that, I wish you a pleasant day and goodbye.